Afternoon and welcome. I'd like to welcome you to the Art Economies project with an acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal country that we are meeting on this afternoon. You've heard a lot of stories during the day about what an extraordinary place remote Australia is and the incredible range and diversity of things it contains, and the art project is another facet of that extraordinary variety that exists in remote Australia. And that variety is cultural diversity. There is creative energy that exists in remote Australia that if you looked at a map only, a conventional map, you wouldn't perhaps recognise that, but there really is a richness and a variety that exists in remote Australia that has been behind the extraordinary success of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art for over 40 years. And I guess the thing that even after quite a few years of working in this industry that still astonishes me is how the breadth of that cultural range that exists out there, from the outer reaches of the Torres Strait, Darnley Island, down to sort of Noongar country, Wadjuk country, south of Perth, through from Culumbaroo to outback New South Wales. The extraordinary range and content that exists amongst the Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people in all those zones is something that I think is expressed at its best in many ways through the art that you see on gallery walls and in many places around whenever we're talking about Australia or Australian identity, it often appears. And that the reason I think that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art has been so successful for 40 years now, it's been one of the very rare and very long-term, very sustained success for remote people, is that it allows an exchange and a reciprocity with mainstream Australia. That really Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews are a long way from the worldviews of mainstream Australia, and art allows an exchange and a point of intersection that is equal, that is respectful, and that works despite perhaps some of the obvious barriers that has worked for a long time. And it's that point of exchange that the Art Economies project is looking at over the next few years. And again, one of the things that I keep coming back to in this project and moving through the industry and the sector more widely is the art that's produced is very local. It's a reflection of the circumstances and the conditions and the qualities of each of the communities it's created in. So again, using that example of Darnley Island in Torres Strait, or Balgo in the Kimberley, or Warrakurna, or Galawinku, whichever point on the map, whichever community you look at, there is a unique set of drivers, unique set of circumstances that exist in that community that make that art distinctive and extraordinary in its own right. It doesn't take very long in this sector to look through a book or visit a gallery and be able to identify individual communities from amongst a wall of paintings. And that variety also adds complexity to it. And when we come to doing things like research and sort of unpacking the issues and often bringing that sort of rigorous or reductionist mindset that researchers do, it becomes a very tangled up, very complicated space, but often also in good ways. And I guess in perhaps one of the ways, or give you a little tour through the way in designing this project that we have sort of understood that complexity and tried to reflect the range and variety of experience and creativity that exists out there. The way we've tried to build that into the research, the 6 research areas that we have. This is a map that's a couple of years old, but it's still reasonably accurate in terms of the spread and number and variety of art enterprises that exist in remote Australia. If you overlay that with the remoteness map, and also maps are complex and contested things when it comes to cross-cultural issues, and you've seen a range of maps today, and this is yet another take on, from the art perspective, of looking at what happens within regions. That Aboriginal art, like I said, exists in as many forms as there are artists and art centres and art communities, but there are also some strong similarities and groupings within those, and we have divided Australia up into 12 remote art regions, and our data analysis and so on, which I'll talk about shortly, works within those regions to understand local conditions and similarities, but also comparisons. For us also, knowing the kind of geography, there's also zones in which the arts sector works. Clearly, artists as the creators and generators of all the cultural and creative products you see. For 40 years or so, they've been producing works that have travelled around the world. That itself is based on thousands and tens of thousands of years of cultural practices, so there's a direct continuity there. Agents take many forms. They're the links between artists and the audiences, consumers around the world, and audiences themselves. It's they're exhibitors, they're writers, they're buyers, and so on. So those three zones link in back and forth. It's not a one-way relationship by any means. And again, each of those zones has their own circumstances, the things that makes them unique or makes them complicated or just adds to the qualities of each of those. And of course, between each of those groups or each of those factors is a series of relationships, again working in both ways. And this is still an oversimplification of things, but this spaghetti map, as we call it, has allowed us to think through and design the research that acknowledges, honours and builds on the sort of circumstances that exist. So for us, stripping it back down to the three basic zones in which the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander art sector works, we've overlaid that with 6 research projects, and I'll talk about each of these in more detail shortly. But we have a scope and scale project, a micro-enterprise project, a consumer-based project looking at buyers, a human resources project, and a freelance artist one, which is a tricky one, and e-commerce, e-business one project. Just before I get on to talking about those projects in a little more detail, just to give update or bring some of the industry circumstances back to the sort of conditions of the last few years. There's been, as I said, there's enormous change and complexity in the industry, but the last few years in particular have seen extra levels of churn. And all those things interplayed have resulted in a fair amount of instability and disconnection within the sector. And out of those challenges have also come opportunities and adaptation. So there's a lot of pressure for art businesses, artists themselves, to adapt, to throw out old assumptions, to look for new ways of doing business, as some of the basic conditions that have and assumptions that have guided the sector for many of its first few decades have perhaps not disappeared, but have certainly changed shape and shrunk and presented some pretty major obstacles. I won't talk about these in detail, but like I said, hopefully that gives you some sense of the sort of external and internal drivers that have really made it a challenging time in the last 4 or 5 years in particular. One of the CRC itself has really invested in and designed this project in response to some of the things I was talking about earlier, that there is an extraordinary success encapsulated by Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander art and art enterprise. And it remains, despite the change, despite the churn, despite the challenges and the need for adaptation, it remains a very potent means of creating a local livelihood. And that local success, the ability for people on country, in small communities, regardless of isolation and so on, to create that livelihood that makes sense, is culturally relevant and makes sense in a local setting. That remains at its core, and in some ways cuts across these things, but it does make it a more difficult business to be in. I just wanted to give a bit more of a detail of our 6 research areas, the 6 projects we have. The Scope and Scale project is in some ways our headline project. It grew out of some recommendations of the 2007 Senate inquiry, looking at trying to answer some of the basic questions of how many, how much, and we're taking that as a starting point, but hopefully we're working our way towards far more refined details and information, which I'll show you some early findings on shortly. But it's a bit of a linking project because it deals with external issues such as funding levels, it deals with market forces, it deals with production and sales and so on within the communities. And analyses those individually, but also finds the linkages between them. The Remote Area Microenterprise project is a large one for us. Again, I'll talk more about that, but it's understanding success and failure factors in 4 different zones out bush. The consumer dynamics is what are people buying and why are they buying it? What are the triggers? What are the motivations? The way, the type of, not so much the type of people, but the way an audience approaches an art fair or a sale in a gallery and so on. There's a complicated and changing profile of people buying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art. Human resources is another key one. It's one of the projects I'm hoping we can grow a little bit because it's one that cuts across so much of remote community life, is the ability to attract and retain staff that give a small non-profit challenged organisation its best chance, and you can often plot the success and failure of an art centre or a community organisation by the quality and continuity of people. So understanding the push and pull factors of people working in remote Australia is crucial for the arts, but it's probably one of our projects that touches on a lot of the CRC's work. The e-business project is another one that I'm a real fan of. I think it's something that can have some very immediate impacts. E-business promises a lot, but it's only delivered for a very small number of art centres and arts enterprises to date. That's a generalisation. There's a lot of subtlety in that, but it's something we'd like to understand more of. And the Art Outside Art Centres is a project that is taking or looking at some of the issues in probably the most complicated zone within the wider industry, which is freelance artists operating in particularly towns like Alice Springs and Katherine, who work outside of, I call the freelance market, who work outside of art centres, and it's the zone in which you get the greatest sort of level of conflict and contestation and media and so on. And it's again, we've got some early findings I'd like to talk you through. This is, of course, an extraordinary team we have. I'm a part-time research leader that has six people on the team. Alice Woodhead is she's our sort of number and systems boss. She's based at Southern Cross Uni and comes from a sort of a big industry, or a long work experience in a variety of industries. And like I said, she's really driving our the analysis and the ways that the findings of the Scope and Scale project in particular can link across to other areas. Because there are, like I said, that's what sort of the Scope and Scale project is essentially the spine of the wider art project, and most of the researchers will be able to draw on that, and Alice is sort of is the architect of that. Susan Congreve, she's one of our PhD candidates at Curtin University, but based in Darwin. She's taking on one of the micro-enterprise projects and looking at the external factors, the enabling environment for art centres in particular, looking at the Central Northern Territory and the Torres Strait. And Kim and Susan have complementary projects. Kim is, again, looking at the success and failure factors, but the other end of the looking glass, she's looking at the community issues, the governance, the politics, the isolation, the kind of mechanics of what makes an art centre succeed or fail at that very community level. And like I said, Susan's looking in from outside of the intersection between art enterprise and those enabling factors of government policy or wider changes in industry. Jessica Booth is our master's student based in Melbourne through UniSA, and she has the Consumer Dynamics project looking at what people are buying and why they're buying it. Michelle Whittle is based at Flinders University in Adelaide and is an honours student looking at the Human Resources project, which involves interviews with about 25 or 30 past and present managers and really unpacking those the push and pull factors, why people take up a job, what they find when they're there, and the triggers as they leave or what makes them leave. And last but by no means least is Iris, who's based at, she's through Southern Cross Uni but based in Alice Springs. She's a part-time honours student but works full-time at one of the arts centres in Alice Springs, Nurajuta, and she's looking at the e-commerce project. She comes from a marketing background, and with the Arts Centre working life to frame her work, it should be an interesting project. And that's one thing that I think why I really enjoy working with this team is that the majority of them have direct and extensive community experience, whether it's in the arts or whether it's remote, having worked with remote communities for many years, the ability to work directly with, sit down with, understand, decode, all the sorts of issues around this has meant that all of them have been able to move very quickly in their project and get a lot of traction and the work through the networks that's necessary to make a project like this work. Okay, quick tour through some early results. This is the scope and scale project that Alice is driving. Like I said, the scope and scale project has 3 buckets of data. We have got about 70 odd of 80 art centres have contributed pretty extensive financial records. That's being processed at the moment. We have about 10 years worth of government funding records from state and Commonwealth that's being processed, and we also have this survey of about 200 of art businesses. So Alice is up to her eyeballs in several 100,000 lines of Excel data. But just for today's purpose, to give you a quick snapshot of some of the early findings have been out of the industry survey. So we could identify around about 200 private and about 80 public art businesses. We put together a pretty extensive survey and got about a 50% response rate. And you'll see a few figures up there about the kind of a quick demographic snapshot, I guess, of the number of Aboriginal people owning those businesses, the location, and the sort of gender split between the business owners. One of the surprise was that how long people had been in business, that the majority of people weren't fly-by-nighters or sort of quick backyard operators, that there had been a continuity and a commitment from many art businesses. A very surprising finding was that nearly over a third of the works sold and bought by these galleries and dealers were purchased directly from artists. I think that's probably a big growth on what it was 5 and certainly 10 years ago, and less than half directly from art centres. Sales were down, which is no surprise, post-GFC, post some of those other conditions that I talked about early, but there was optimism out there that people actually expected growth over the next 5 years. I love a good pie chart. It's made me very happy in the last few months as various researchers have sent in a little trial pie chart, and I never thought I would be so happy to see a little colourful chart on my email. But again, just 2 quick ones from this survey. Where buyers are located, so this is asking galleries and dealers where their customers are located. Majority in New South Wales, but a few other surprises in there, what a large proportion the Northern Territory is. And also asking a different end of the survey asked about where people expected growth and contraction in the market. So some different market sectors from private buyers, international buyers and so on, where they expected growth to come. No surprise that the superannuation end, for example, is where they're expecting lots of contraction still following some regulatory changes. This is the survey of artists who worked outside art centres, and we did about 65 artists interviews, or say we, the business development unit of the community researchers of Ninti 1 did those surveys in Alice Springs and Katherine and a couple out bush. And again, still being processed. It's a fairly extensive survey and it needs a lot of interpretation, and it also needs to link across to about 20 surveys and interviews we did with dealers and private agents in Alice Springs. So there's some real crossover things that need to be teased out. And again, a quick snapshot. We asked a question about how people adapted their own artistic practice depending on who they were selling the painting to, and nearly 2/3 of artists said that they painted or produced different work for different, according to the customer or the gallery they were selling to. And a couple of these, some of the findings, there were sort of two threads for me as I glanced through them, was that some things kind of debunked assumptions that work in this sector. And as I said earlier, this is a sector that has lots of controversy, and there's accusations about unethical conduct and unconscionable dealings and so on. And the truth of those is fuzzy at best, but there are often a lot of assumptions that are tossed around. And these are two, for example, that I think start debunking some of those assumptions. So, for example, the second one, that 4/5 of people don't get book up, and by that there's often an assumption in this sector that people are indebted constantly to their dealer, that they only paid in response to, or forced to pay in response to having some indeterminate amount of book up. But 4/5 of people said they don't have a book up relationship with their dealers. On the other side of the coin, though, there was also some affirmations of the lack of the sort of deficits in the freelance artist market. So 3/4 of people had never heard of or weren't sure about copyright. And as you can see, a large percentage of people, 4/5 of people had no idea where to go if they felt taken advantage of, or if there was an issue that they wanted to be resolved. So some enormous deficits, and we're thinking through now about what we can do with these sort of immediate findings, and there are some obvious sort of partners we might work with to sort of package up some of these things and provide some professional support and advice for artists. And anecdotally, at least, I think this is one sector that will continue to grow. More artists, as younger artists, people more town-based come into being artists on a part-time or full-time basis. I think freelance art market will continue to grow. And a quick tour through some of the findings that Jessa did through the audience surveys. So she did about 1,000 surveys at 3 art fairs, and she's now doing a complementary, much smaller set of surveys through dealers and by sort of collectors and connoisseurs and so on, to see how those things correlate. Again, a quick snapshot of the art fair goers. Certainly a dominated majority, 3/4 of people attending art fairs are female. Nearly half of people bought an acrylic painting, so paintings is by far and away the sort of number one medium. But also price sensitivity, that great majority of people were unwilling to spend more than a few $100s. And given the amount of difficulty and the sort of profile and arguments around some of the regulatory changes, it was surprising to hear how few people had awareness of things like industry code of conduct and so on. There was the correlation was that people were interested in learning more. So the people wanted to be informed but felt there was a lack of information out there. And just getting close to the end, this is, I guess, a broader sort of take on where we're expecting our outcomes to be. And some of these, as I said, some of these outcomes we're expecting to be very direct, explicit, practical things, like from the HR project or from the e-commerce project. We can take a package of things out to an art centre or a community or an artist or a peak body or something and say, look, here are some findings, here are some ways to fairly easily, fairly quickly reshape what you do, improve your recruitment practice, improve, spend your marketing money in a different way on websites, for example. So we're looking at some, like I said, some very explicit sort of take-home, not easy perhaps, but some very discrete sort of findings that people can apply. Also acknowledging that there will be a range of longer-term and broader outcomes that will take a while to filter through the system, whether that's through policy changes, whether that's through advocacy, whether that's this adaptation process that a lot of art businesses are going through will take a while to perhaps include this information in what they do. But really for us the principle is that we're providing information to people who are undergoing, or organisations that are undergoing, that need information in the face of adaptation. There's undoubtedly a lot of change that will be occurring in the next few years, and we're very strong on making sure that what we're providing is information to assist people in that process. Okay, that's me if anyone wants to chat, but I guess just to conclude, it's really, in remote settings, art business, art centres and so on is often a code for other things like there's livelihoods, training, cultural maintenance, the cultural life of the community and so on. So, and art centres are often people who know them recognise it, but that it's often under-acknowledged more widely, that the role of art in a community is only partly about selling goods and products into the marketplace. It's the richer, the wider contribution that makes to people's livelihoods out bush. And undoubtedly there's an enormous number of challenges for artists as individuals, for their communities in coming years, and we are working hard to make sure that our research is a direct contribution to some of those challenges and solving some of those issues. But for us, the basic principle is that art and art business remains highly visible, as strong as it can be, and very vibrant part of remote Australia. So thank you for listening, and if anyone wants to chat later, we'd love to talk further. Thank you.